Welcome back to the AR Files presented by 9-Hole Reviews and brought to you by Slate Black Industries. Be sure to check out slateBlackIndustries.com. In this episode, we're looking specifically at the evolution and historic progression of the AR-15 Handguard. Unlike some elements of the rifle which have remained relatively consistent over the life of this platform, the last 20 to 30 years have seen massive innovative changes to the Handguard, most with immense and positive impact on the overall combat effectiveness and performance of the setup. Starting with its inception in the late 1950s, the M16 utilized a polymer handguard, a major departure from its wooden predecessors more common in the era. The original handguard was the now famous triangle shape, but this handguard did have reported issues with cracking and was ultimately replaced with what we now consider the quote-unquote standard rounded handguard with the release of the M16A2. Not only was this a logistical simplification since the handguard's upper and lower parts were now identical, unlike on the A1 which had specific left and right sides, but it also brought with it an improvement to the longevity and durability of the handguard as well. Now, the polymer handguards are held in place by a part called the delta ring, which is basically a locking collar attached at the barrel nut, which is pressed forward via a spring over the rear lips of the handguard. The front lips lock into the back of the front sight gas block via a retaining plate. This attachment method is relevant since the point of contact at the gas block creates an area where forces applied to the handguard are indeed translated directly into the barrel. More on this in a moment. Now, as we look to the late 1980s and early 90s, technology was developing, and Special Forces operators began taking advantage, strapping things like dive lights to the handguards of their CAR-15s. In this same period of time, we then have the events of Operation Gothic Serpent, or what is mostly known today as Black Hawk Down. Many suggest this combat action in Mogadishu, Somalia was the catalyst for much of the adoption of the ongoing modernizations for the AR platform, which took place in the coming years and were carried forward into the global war on terror era. In 1995, Knight's Armament Company introduced the RIS rail system, replacing the original plastic handguards which had accompanied the Armalite rifles since their inception and allowed users to attach their weapon lights, laser aiming modules, and other mission-essential equipment straight to the firearm, making use of the Picatinny rail interface. These rails were drop-in replacements, so the mounting interface remained unchanged and still allowed pressure to be translated to the barrel. And Knights wasn't the only company working to update the AR platform either. Atlantic Research Marketing System, ARMS, was also creating numerous designs for attachment of accessories via various rail systems, both handguard and receiver mounted. In the early 90s, ARMS was one of the original manufacturers of a free float designed rail, which didn't utilize the delta ring or gas block retaining plate for the handguard and instead allowed the barrel to sit completely unaffected by forces applied to the handguard. While this system wasn't adopted at the time, free float handguards would be adopted by SOCOM by the mid-2000s. It's worth mentioning that in the late 80s and 90s, competitive shooters were, by all reports, already utilizing free float mechanisms for service rifle matches, machining and using their own free float sleeves, which were effectively metal tubes, preventing pressures applied to the handguard from reaching the barrel. So it's no secret that free floating would be the next reasonable evolution to the standard mass-produced AR handguard, and by the mid-2000s, these were everywhere in the commercial sector with the sunsetting of the assault weapons ban in 2004. And as the GWAT was at full swing, the military also began utilizing free float handguards, specifically on the Mark 12 SPR, and eventually adopting a free float quad rail from Daniel Defense for use on the Block 2 program. Interesting piece here, the DD rail and others like it actually have a cutout for the front sight post and gas block, so that no gas block replacement would be required to run this handguard. And while SOCOM was adopting this free float full quad rail, three gunners had long since used non-quad rail tube-style handguards, some even without a top row of Picatinny, for a number of years. And by the 2010 to 2012 timeframe, alternatives to free float quad rails in the wider civilian sector began to pop up. These longer free float tubular handguards shared many characteristics with the three-gun style handguards, and shaved weight and exterior dimension by losing the full-length quad rails and instead offered bolt-on pieces of Picatinny rail that the user could configure where needed. These tubular handguards all ran proprietary bolt-on interfaces. That is, until 2012, when Noveske Rifle Works and Voltor Weapon Systems released the Keymod mounting interface, followed shortly by Magpul's M-LOK interface in 2014. In 2017, Crane released testing which concluded that the M-LOK system was favored in attachment repeatability and durability. This report ultimately led to M-LOK becoming the gold standard interface for handguards moving forward. And while Keymod isn't completely dead and gone today, it's very rare to find new products releasing with the Keymod interface. As an editorial note, it's not as if these tests by Crane concluded that Keymod was ineffective, simply that M-LOK was superior in surviving and passing the testing protocols. And this brings us forward to present day, where SOCOM has now adopted the Upper Receiver Group Improved, or URGI, to phase out the Block 2. This upper includes the Geisley Mark 16 free-float tubular M-LOK handguard, aligned with the most popular slimmed modular handguards in the civilian sector. And so there you have it, a basic history on the development and progression of the AR-15 handguard and rail system, from the 1950s to current. When it comes to selecting a handguard for your setup, there are numerous considerations to take into account, most originating with what capabilities you need out of the system. And we'll be diving into these at length in our next episode. And so until next time, we'll see you on the range.
716 is Gillnet 6, 4 Vic, 8 packs, Redcon 1, green to green. How copy, over?
296, this is 716, roger, over. 16, Bill Knight 1, 1 pack, green, green, over. This is 716, roger, over.
16, Bill Knight 2, 1 Victor, 2 packs, Redcon 1, over.